I'm Lisa Evers, and this is Street Soldiers.
Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
Just when you thought you'd heard it all about the R. Kelly case, there's a new twist to the story or a new allegation. But is the media circus making us blind to truth and justice? Another crush of cameras and another day in court for R&B star R. Kelly. This time an unsuccessful bid to get his $21,000 a month child support reduced. There's been a barrage of accusations and a grand jury indictment. Yet the disturbing nature of the sex abuse charges against him has not diminished public interest in media coverage. In fact, it's had the opposite effect.
People are obsessed with celebrities. I mean, we live in the era of reality shows. You know, people are more concerned with what's going on with these Hollywood types than they are with their friends, their own family.
At the moment, there's no better way to guarantee major media attention for yourself, your clients, or your career than to tie it somehow to R. Kelly.
Why would your publicist be doing national networks? I think that's why it's becoming a media frenzy, because everybody is using this as an opportunity to build their name. Despite a string of claims and allegations spanning decades and a child pornography case which he won, she took me back. The multi-platinum, multi-Grammy award-winning singer and songwriter has never been convicted of a crime. That could change. Negative headlines could taint a jury pool, says criminal defense attorney Lance Clark.
When it becomes a media circus and when the media gets involved, it makes it increasingly difficult for someone to get a fair trial because it takes the power out of the courtroom and puts it into the hands of the media.
So where do we go from here? Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me is Julio Rivera. He's a political columnist, a media consultant, and Republican strategist. Julio, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much. And also joining us is Rochelle Ritchie. She's a political analyst and former congressional press secretary. Rochelle, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Lance Clark. He's a criminal defense attorney with Bernstein, Clark, and Moskowitz. Thank you all for being with us for this topic.
Thank you.
Rochelle, as you look at this case, what strikes you about the media coverage?
Well, it's a media circus, like you said. I think that, you know, but it would be sort of irresponsible for any network not to watch that Lifetime docuseries and then, you know, spin it into an additional story, as we saw with Gayle King. I think what's unfortunate, though, is that there are so many other issues in regards to sexual abuse, particularly in the Black community, that are not being addressed because the person committing those crimes is not R. Kelly or, you know, is not Michael Jackson. I mean, if you look at the Bureau of Justice statistics, you know, 1 in 6 men are sexually assaulted. And those statistics also show that a majority of those victims are African-American men in low-income communities, such as the one that R. Kelly grew up in Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And so I think that, you know, while, yes, we should, you know, really, you know, focus in on the fact that R. Kelly was allegedly sexually abusing girls, I think the bigger part of the conversation we should also be having is the sexual abuse that he experienced, because we know that the abused also become abusers.
They tend to become abusers.
Right.
Julio, when you look at this spectacle, what about the R. Kelly case makes it such an amazing, so amazingly attractive to the media?
Well, I mean,
and the public too, because if people weren't watching it, we wouldn't be doing it.
Well, we live in a society right now where we make heroes out of regular people. I mean, we have people know more about Rob Kardashian than they know about members of their own family. All these reality shows and reality series. And in America, we like to build people up and make them into heroes. You know, so when they come down, when they come crashing down, you know, it becomes a spectacle that everybody wants to take a look at. But I'm more concerned, and to speak to your point, we don't know necessarily whether or not R. Kelly ever was necessarily sexually abused, but what we do see here is a pronounced pattern of this type of behavior. You know, this is not the first allegations that have surfaced against R. Kelly. You know, I mean, I definitely don't like to see him portrayed as a victim here. I mean, the victims here are truly the underage girls. And, you know, I would say also, in addition to that, as a caveat, that, you know, the parents of these children are just as culpable as R. Kelly in this, because they've exposed their kids to danger, I think, by letting them around R. Kelly.
So this is hitting every possible nerve in society.
Yes, yeah, definitely, because I mean, this is an issue that families have to deal with. We have to be careful. I have a 16-year-old daughter. I mean, and I certainly would never allow her to be, you know, with a grown man unsupervised for a long period of time, the way these parents seem to have allowed for their children to spend all this time with R. Kelly. And listen, a lot of times the parents get blinded by the the fame and the fortune and the lifestyle and things like that. But that's not fair to the children.
Well, and we're going to talk about that, because about what the real issues, as Rochelle said, that are getting kind of obscured by this whole thing. Lance, when you look at the whole legal aspect of this, what are the real legal cases, and then what are all these accusations that are flying around in the media? How do you sort through that?
Well, from a legal standard, the media circus tends to turn into a trial by media, which potentially has the possibility of undermining a courtroom. And when that happens, then it takes away the defendant's Sixth Amendment right to an unbiased juror. When you have things in the media that are there months and years, how does this person not be affected by that? How do you expect this person to go into that courtroom and look solely at the facts that the judge says that you have to look at, without thinking about what you heard in the cola room, what you heard at your work, what you read, what you saw? And we put a lot of pressure on these jurors to not bring in their life stories into the courtroom and what they've seen, read, and heard for so long. And when you have these media circuses, it tends to then take away from the power of the courtroom and puts it in the hands of the media.
Rochelle, you were the spokesperson for the state's attorney in Baltimore at the time of the whole Freddie Gray tragedy. I was there in Baltimore during the incidents on the streets that were happening on the streets. What kind of pressure does this media put on prosecutors when you're in a high-profile trial?
Well, really quickly, I want to go back to something. High-profile case. I want to go back to something that we were talking about with the media circus.
And guys, please feel free to jump in too.
I think that the media circus is also the fault of R. Kelly's publicist and his attorney. There is no reason that he should have been sitting down with Gayle King. And furthermore, if you're a good publicist or an attorney and you're sitting in that room and you see your client starting to get a little emotional, starting to get a little bit irate, you're going to say, I was a former reporter, you're going to say, stop the cameras for a second. I need to talk to my client.
Right.
And you're going to pull them out of the room.
We need a moment.
You're going to bring them back down. But the idea of continuing to let the cameras continue to roll while he had this sort of outburst was really a disservice.
What about that, Julio? What about that? Some people thought that was a brilliant move. That's what it was.
Exactly.
Horrible from a
well, okay, one time. So what do you think?
No, I think
Some
he was
people
trying
say
to
it was a brilliant
change the
move.
narrative and try to control the narrative because if you listen to what he was saying, I mean, to me, it looked like it sounded, even his tonality when he was yelling, it almost reminded me of those Mr. Big songs.
But I'm not talking about what R. Kelly did. I'm talking about what his publicist and
I understand,
attorney.
but I think it was by
Let's
design.
talk about that moment, though.
What he wanted to do was
You
he wanted
think
to
that was
cast
calculated?
blame. Yes, I thought he wanted to cast blame on the parents, make it look like they're being opportunistic. He said it, that these parents said that we're going to ruin your career. So right there, he's trying to curry sympathy. And quite frankly, I don't feel that he's entitled to any sympathy, but I think it was done by design.
Lance, what about that?
I think it was a horrible, horrible decision on the part of his legal team and PR team. When you see this interview, I think he's more concerned with R. Kelly, the artist, than Robert Kelly, the defendant. Yep. Now, any defense attorney would hate to have their client go on the media and give these statements, especially when you have pending accusations. I believe there's another investigation in the Eastern District of New York. There are other investigations in other states. You have all these potential cases that are out there, and all you're doing is putting fuel to the fire. And any defense attorney just sitting there holding their head like, what are you doing? Keep your mouth closed. But you can't.
And that's kind of how it was for me when I was at the state's attorney's office. When we went to have the press conference where the state's attorney pressed the charges against the 6 Baltimore police officers, as a spokesperson and director of communications, my idea was knock out all the media coverage today. And then after that, we go behind closed doors, because you don't want to sort of paint this image of being an opportunist by continuing to do, a lot of media coverage. Now, that was not necessarily what happened. There were people higher up than me that sort of, made other decisions that I personally would not have made. But I think that prosecutors are not motivated by media coverage to press charges. I think prosecutors are motivated by evidence and, by their pursuit of justice.
Okay, we're going to pick up. We're going to take a short break. We're going to pick up on that point, because some people thought in Chicago a lot of the timing of everything was from the media pressure. We'll talk about that. This is Street Soldiers. I'm your host, Lisa Evers. We'll be right back.
But listen, I understand we all have a right to be considered innocent until proven guilty, but there's just way too much mounting evidence.
Michelle, you say when you were in 2015 at the state's attorney's office in Baltimore during the whole Freddie Gray situation, that the media and what was being said, because that was a very big case under national scrutiny, it didn't play a role in what the prosecutors did?
No, absolutely not. The state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, decided to charge those officers because of the evidence that she had at the time. The media was not an influence. The violence in the streets that was happening, the riots and everything, was not an influence on her decision to press those charges. And I think what we're starting to see with these high-profile cases, such as the one with R. Kelly, you know, Kimberly Fox, when she came out and gave her statements about the charges, she was very direct. She did not have any sort of emotional reaction to it. She did not give her personal or imply any sort of personal biases in her statement. And she read the charges and she left. And so I think that is sort of the image that we expect to see from prosecutors when we're trying to think that they're being...
Right, that's the image. But a lot of people were saying, well, why did this happen so soon after the docuseries aired, and why didn't this air before, especially since these were such old charges? Lance, what do you think about that?
You know, I think that's a specific instance what happened in Baltimore. I don't think that's the norm. When you look at what happened in Chicago, the young man that was killed, and they suppressed that tape for about a year.
By the police officer.
Until it came out. Laquan McDonald, thank you. If there wasn't public pressure, would there have been any charges? Look at the Walter Scott situation in South Carolina. Had not there been any public pressure, would there be any charges? I think we give prosecutors too much credit. I don't want to say too much credit. They deserve credit. But I think we give prosecutors too much credit to say that they would do these things but not for political force or but not for media coverage, because the media does move things these days. Someone posts one meme, someone else retweets that one meme, and then 1,000 people read it a day, and then it gets to higher ups and they say, hey, well, we have to do something about this.
Julio, what about that? Because, I mean, the public pressure, prosecutors can only do, there's so many cases, they can only do but so much. What did you think as you looked at what happened in Chicago, where after the docuseries, now these charges, these very old charges, you know, are brought up?
Well, I mean, I think that it may have been some opportunistic timing, you know, as far as for people who actually have claims against him now. Because you got to remember, too, if you look down the history, there were a lot of women that received financial settlement from R. Kelly. So that was a prime opportunity for people to put pressure on him on the heels of the docuseries. Now, you know, anything that may have been done that was considered, you know, a civil tort, you know, that you wind up getting paid out of it, is different than actually breaking the law. Like, you know, if he had sex with underage women, he videotaped it, held them against their will, anything like that should justifiably be investigated by prosecutors and by the police department.
Lance, what about the statute of limitations on this? Because people were
wondering about that too.
And what do you guys think about that?
Just in full disclosure, I don't practice in Illinois, but I do believe that it's 20 years from the date that the minor turns 18. So I think they have until the age of 38 to bring forward these charges. So a lot of these charges, to the best of my ability, I think they're 10 years old or so. But if the minor was 15 or 16, you know, then they turn 18, 2 years plus another 20 years. I think they're well within the statute of limitations, with the disclosure that I don't practice in the state of Illinois.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also a question as far as, because I know he has these other charges in other states where it's being investigated. So it's also the age of consent, because I think the age of consent is very different in Illinois to Georgia to New York to Pennsylvania and wherever else he may have had these alleged sexual acts with young girls. So I think that is going to be a huge factor in all of this. And when you watch that docuseries, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a part in there that I think should have got more attention. And this was it was a juror that said that he just didn't like the victims. He just didn't like the girls. I don't know if you remember that, but he was basically talking about how he didn't like the way they dressed. And it was a quick little blurb in there where they had talked to a member of the jury. And that was really concerning to me, because this juror was not supposed to be in there deciding who he liked and who he didn't like. He was supposed to be looking at the evidence and deciding if he could find with, you know, unreasonable doubt that this man was guilty. And that's not what happened.
That's perfect. And in a perfect world, that's what happened. But in reality, that's never, ever, ever what happens. The juror is looking at how the lawyer dressed, how the defendant is dressed. Why is the defendant sitting in that chair? You know, the presumption of innocence is just the words, the presumption of innocence. When a juror walks into a room, they're not sitting in defendant chair, so they're saying he must have done something because I'm not sitting there. So to say that someone is presumed innocent are just words. To say that the person holding the scales of justice is blindfold is just a statue that we see when we go in the courtroom. These things are not, they supposed to matter, and sometimes they do matter. But the things that really do matter is how the juror feels about a particular person. You know, I have many cases where I've won, and it's because jurors felt more comfortable with the defense team than they did with the prosecutors. It's just
the way it goes.
But I'm
It's just
talking
these
about the
uncontrollable.
victims. I'm talking about women that
No, it's a
are
shame.
No, and
girls.
that's
Yeah,
something
that
with
was-
sex crimes. It's always where it's put on the victim. The you know, the pressure is put on the victim, and the
to
blame is
appear
put
a
on the
certain kind of
victim.
way. And she
as a-
wasn't even there. That was the other thing. She wasn't there. So this, I don't know who he was judging his, you know, making these judgments.
No, it's wrong,
based
but it's
on.
realistic.
Yeah.
It's wrong. It shouldn't happen. It's very bad.
But
it's
also,
realistic.
some people say with a child pornography case where R. Kelly was acquitted, and we have to point out he has never been convicted of a crime like this, accused now, and we'll see what happens. But was he, you know, was the fact that the victim wasn't there and the parents weren't involved?
Yeah, I mean, to me, with him, it's just there's a pronounced pattern of this type of behavior. But as far as he was acquitted, and you have to take that into consideration. But I just think that there's just a laundry list of other things like these out of court, settlements. You know, maybe if that information, obviously, most of the time these things are sealed. But I think that information, if there was a possibility that those records could be subpoenaed just to shed more light on context. Because, I mean, you've got multiple criminal investigations going on right now, and if a grand jury was able to return charges on him, then obviously there has to be evidence that he did do something.
Rochelle, go ahead.
That's not actually. Well, if a grand jury returns an indictment, that just means there's probable cause to go forward on the case. And we've all heard, you know, you can prosecute an indicted ham sandwich because the burden of proof is just so low. Probable cause is it possible that he did it? And if it's possible that he did it,
That's all
then
it is.
Is it possible that this person did this? And that's what probable cause is. That doesn't mean they're guilty, because once you go to trial, it's guilty. You have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher burden. But just because someone is indicted, it's not indicative of anything, of any wrongdoing that was done.
How would you find yours?
How would you find
Rochelle, How
them?
would you
Yeah.
find yours, Rochelle?
I don't know. And especially in Chicago, I mean,
Right,
Exactly, that's
in
the point.
Chicago,
Yeah.
And
he's like
the, and
such a
the
huge
key
star.
is we have to remember that it took 6 years for him to go to trial for the first allegation. It was 6 years before they even went to trial. So it seemed like that was one of the strategies of the attorneys then, and I wonder if that's going to be the strategy now, because 6 years from now, you know, we're going to be talking about something else, and people are going to tend to
To
forget
wait
about
it out. To
Wait it
wait
out.
out the clock.
Exactly what you said. People tend to forget. Now, you might remember the shirt and tie that I have on today. You may remember it tomorrow. But in a week from now, are you going to remember it? Now,
Not in today's society.
Exactly. You're getting bogged with so many pictures on social media, on media, on TV, especially in New York City. When you walk around, you see things all the time. So
and
as,
one scandal's like scandal du jour.
as time elapses, so does one's memory. And the longer it takes for an allegation to go to trial, sometimes that's a strategic move on the part of the defense because it's helpful for your client.
So you're saying they might try to drag this out, which is going to take time anyway, but
Especially when I think he has 10 counts and it's multiple states and the IRS,
different
the FBI.
different alleged victims
Yeah.
Child support,
and all
everything.
that. Julio, what do you think? Wait it out?
I think that's probably his best legal strategy. I think at the end of the day, we're probably going to wind up with either the charges being dropped or he's going to get a deal where he's not going to get found guilty and convicted of what he actually committed, but something far lesser.
Something like that. All right. I want to thank all of you for being with us for this
Thanks,
episode
Sarah.
of Street
Thank you.
Soldiers. Julio Rivera, thanks so much for being with us. Rochelle Ritchie, great to have you with us. Thank you. And Lance Clark, great to have you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers. I'm Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I hope it's your only weapon. Let's push for peace.